Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Jolly, Director of the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. We're very pleased to have Nikhil Goyal here this evening. We'll introduce him in just a minute. A couple of things, if you can turn off your cell phones, not those of you at home. And the bathrooms here are in the basement. You have to take the elevator to get there. The statewide sponsor for the Vermont Humanities Snapshot Series is the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, through the Vermont Department of Libraries. And because we haven't done live events in a while, it's my pleasure to say, as far as I'm concerned, your tax dollars at work. There's an event here tomorrow night at the Athenaeum. We are the host for Umbrella's Stories of Hope and Healing, offering insight into recovery and resilience. Award-winning documentary filmmaker and theater producer Bess O'Brien will introduce the events here, and that program starts at 6 p.m. Many of our programs start at 7. That one is at 6 tomorrow. Now I want to introduce Ryan Newswanger, who's Director of Programs for Vermont Humanities, to say hello to us and to welcome our speaker. Ryan?
Hi. I was going to introduce myself as Director of Programs, but Bob already did that. So thank you for coming here to the Athenaeum. Thanks for watching from home. This is our Snapshot series. A lot of you knew this as First Wednesdays. With Snapshot this year, what we're doing is live streaming every presentation. So if you're not able to join us here in person in St. Johnsbury or the 8 other locations where we hold Snapshot events every week, we're glad that you can join us from home. So I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Nikhil Goyal is a sociologist who is taught at New York University, and he's the author of Live to See the Day, Coming of Age in American Poverty, which was published by Metropolitan Macmillan in 2023. He served as senior policy advisor on education and children for Chairman Senator Bernie Sanders on the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and Committee on the Budget. He developed education, child care, and child tax credit federal legislation, as well as a tuition-free college program for incarcerated people and correctional workers in Vermont. Goyal earned his BA at Goddard College, here in Vermont, and Masters of Philosophy and PhD at the University of Cambridge. So, welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. That was really appreciate the introductions, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks for all of you for attending, and for those of you who are watching online. So I thought I'd speak for about 35 minutes, and then open it up for some discussion and some dialogue. So this book, Live to See the Day, Coming of Age in American Poverty, grew out of conversations and an interest of mine to examine the high school dropout crisis. And this was an interest that started when I was a student, actually, at Goddard College. And with the help of my advisor, Bobby Buchanan, I was trying to figure out what was my next topic of research. I'd been writing about public education and the lives of children for a number of years, but I wanted to look at it from a newer scope. And there had been a lot of discussion and debate around the high school dropout issue, particularly in terms of what I would call the blame the victim narrative, where we tend to blame children for their inability to complete school on time. And I thought it was really important to examine some of the structural conditions that might lead young people to leave school early, as well as the larger political economy at play in the lives of these children. And so I reached out to a friend named Andrew Frischman, who runs an organization called Big Picture Learning. And this is an organization that has dozens of public progressive schools around the United States. And he suggested I go visit El Centro de Estudiantes, an alternative last chance high school in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. And I thought I was going to write a story about these students and staff, and that was going to be it. But that project evolved and snowballed into something much larger. My master's and PhD thesis and dissertation, and then this book. So when I began to spend time at El Centro, I was given full access to the school building. I'm very grateful for the fact that this school allowed me to wander the halls freely, sit in on classes and activities, talk to whomever I wanted with their consent and permission. And I learned a number of striking things about this school. The model, the big picture learning model, is rooted in community as the classroom. The students will spend 2 days a week in internships and real-world learning experiences and businesses and cultural institutions and libraries and museums. And then in the school itself, the learning is based on project-based learning. So the students will design with their advisors, known as teachers, various projects based on their own interests and passions. And the structure of the school is based on an advisory model, with one advisor and a group of students. And that creates a sense of real community where every student and child is known by another adult in the school. And it helps strengthen and build strong relationships between students and advisors and their peers. And then they also have a couple other practices. They have restorative justice, as opposed to zero-tolerance school discipline. And they have exhibition style of assessment. So the students are evaluated in exhibitions and each trimester, where they have a group of their teachers and advisors and mentors and adults come together and be part of the process of evaluating their work and progress throughout that trimester. And so I learned, it was profoundly powerful for me to learn about the school and the students' experiences. And I was interested as well to understand their past school experiences and struggles with education and other challenges in American society. And so a little bit about the book. So the book really focuses on 3 of these young people. I interviewed hundreds of young people as part of a larger ethnographic study in the neighborhood of Kensington. But I chose 3 of them to, I think, illustrate, one, their stories and struggles, but larger economic and social institutions and policies at play. So I start the book off with a story of Ryan Rivera. And he's in middle school. He's just a month shy of turning 13. And he's a troublemaker. He's got into lots of mischief at school, racked up dozens of disciplinary infractions over the years, and also had lots of difficulty doing well in the classroom. And so one day he and his friends are engaging in some mischief, skipping class, and they're they decide to challenge each other to light some pieces of paper on fire, ripped out of a school notebook. And one of the kids challenges the other, why don't we light a trash can on fire? And so Ryan and the kids throw burning sheets of paper into the trash can, and eventually they snuff them out with the trash bag. But then they leave one of the burning pieces of paper in the trash can, and then flee. And so a little bit while later, Ryan is sitting in the auditorium, just about to go to lunch in the cafeteria, and the school principal and dean find him and say, "You're coming with us." And they bring him to a room where the school resource officers are stationed. And in this room, he's interrogated without the presence of an adult or a parent or anybody else that he knows, and then confesses to being one of the kids involved in starting this fire. Fortunately, the fire had been quickly extinguished and was found by a staff member who put it out. But instead of this child who engages in a reckless act of stupidity, instead of this child being given mentorship and support and counseling and some form of restorative justice, he is interrogated, arrested, and then funneled in and out of the juvenile justice system of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania. And so I narrate his experiences going through this system over the next several months. This is a child, a 12-year-old boy who is been hyper criminalized for this offense, and then I trace this time when he comes back to Philadelphia. He gets expelled from Grover Washington, his middle school, and then gets transferred to an alternative for-profit disciplinary school called Community Education Partners. And Community Education Partners was a company started by a group of men who had ties to the Republican Party, and they started it in 1996. And so this was, if you recall, a period of American history where there was a heightened fear of juvenile crime. Juvenile crime had been going up dramatically over the past decade, and there was talk of super predators and an entire generation of young people trying to maraud American people and society. And so the policymakers wanted to ratchet up penalties on these young people and incapacitate them, prosecute them as adults, and then as a way to crack down on juvenile crime. And so they were operating within this environment, and they made a pitch, CEP executives, they made a pitch to school district officials around the country, and they said, you have students who are misbehaved, who are disobedient, who are low educational performers. Give them to us. Give them to us, and we'll warehouse them in our institutions, where you don't have to worry about them causing ruckus or disruption in the classrooms. You don't have to worry about them affecting your test scores or attendance rates or any other educational metrics that are important for federal funding, among other things. Give them to us. And so they got contracts from Dallas to Houston, and they exported this model to districts around the country, and they received contracts to operate these very regimented disciplinary schools. And so Ryan, he gets expelled and gets sent to CEP. CEP started in Philadelphia in the early 2000s. It was brought by a group of lawmakers in Harrisburg, as well as school district officials. And what the remarkable thing about it was that CEP executives had lobbied very strenuously lawmakers in Harrisburg to adopt and implement this alternative school funding in this way to the for-profit provider. And they drew on both. They drew on campaign donations to Democratic and Republican lawmakers, and were able to get contracts and this huge pot of money. And then they were able to change a law where if you were a young person who committed a juvenile offense, criminal offense, and was sent to, say, a juvenile detention center outside of Philadelphia, you could not return to your traditional neighborhood public school unless you went to a disciplinary school first. So it was a way, in many respects, to build a pipeline of customers from the juvenile detention centers into schools like CEP. So just the web of the tentacles of for-profit and the criminal justice system and public education all came together in this one school. So Ryan comes to the school. He has to go through a metal detector. He has to get searched and frisked by a security officer, and then has to literally walk with his hands behind his back into what are called communities. And he goes, and in each community, you enter at the beginning of the day, and you don't leave until the end of the day. And in the classrooms, there's very little formal instruction. There's very little learning. There's lots of fights, lots of chaos and violence. And I would argue that the purpose of CEP is to warehouse the educational untouchables, the kids that no one else wants to deal with. So it was just a terrible form of education, of warehousing, not of rehabilitation or care for some of the most marginalized children in the city who had been dealing with huge amounts of economic and social challenges, as well as other behavioral issues as well. So I traced Ryan's life from going to CEP and then coming to El Centro, a radically different educational environment where he's treated not as a criminal, but as a human being. And I talk about in one of the chapters his experience at El Centro when it's threatened to be closed down by the School District of Philadelphia. There were major budget deficits, and the alternative schools were put on the chopping block, and El Centro was one of them. And for a kid who had hated going to school, who was constantly getting into trouble, and all sorts of things, came to El Centro and then defended El Centro at a city council meeting where he said, "Don't close my school. This is my home." So I think it's just a testament to the support that he got at El Centro, the caring teachers and educators, and the fact that he actually genuinely enjoyed going to school every day and learning. And so that's a little bit about Ryan. And the second character, a main character in the book, is a young person named Emmanuel, now known as Karem. And Emmanuel grew up in Kensington. He was raised by a single Puerto Rican mother who was severely disabled. And together, they lived off of less than $10,000 a year in supplemental security income, SSI, and temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, plus food stamps, which meant that they lived in pretty deep poverty. And what this entailed was that these two people endured constant evictions, several evictions a year, dilapidated, inhabitable housing, food insecurity, and hunger, where they often ran out of food each month, well before the end of the month, and had to rely on food pantries and other forms of public assistance. They had to live in neighborhoods that were some of the most violent neighborhoods in the country, where at any moment just walking out of your front door meant that you were at risk of getting shot or mugged or assaulted. So the constant peril of violence, or the threat of violence, took a toll on these people's lives in the most intimate and physical ways. And so I traced Manuel's life growing up and his childhood, enduring all these struggles, the effects that it had on his educational experience, how when he was moving around a lot, that meant that he had to upend his entire friendships, his relationships with his teachers, move into unfamiliar neighborhoods, and then go to those schools. And that meant he sometimes failed classes, or even one time failed a grade and had to be held back. And it wasn't because he wasn't smart. It was because the toxic stress and instability and all the other issues really derail a child's ability to do well in school. And one of the points that I make in the book that I think is something that I hope people will recognize is that the issues of poverty and incarceration and housing insecurity and toxic stress and trauma and hunger, those issues don't get left behind when children walk into school. They get carried into the classroom. They affect a child's ability to learn, their self-worth, their aspirations, and it affects their interactions with their teachers and their classmates. So to me, it was really important to not just talk about schools as isolated institutions, but as institutions that are deeply embedded within communities and the larger economic conditions. And so eventually Emmanuel reaches his teenage years and begins to grapple with his sexuality. He is going to a charter school called Esperanza Charter School, and there as he's going and dealing with his sexuality, he confronts and has to deal with homophobic teachers. There was one moment where he had missed so much school, especially due to the kind of suffering he had endured. He had missed so much school and was making up a exam. And as he was sitting in the room going through the exam, he overheard two teachers talk about the upcoming election. This was 2012. And one of the teachers goes, I can never vote for President Obama again because he has now endorsed same-sex marriage. And so for a child who thought he might be queer, and to hear that from a teacher in an educational setting was utterly demoralizing. It made him feel that he was completely alone in this world and didn't have anyone else to turn to. And then when he came out to his mother as bisexual later on, his mother, who's a Pentecostal Christian woman, very deeply religiously conservative, begins to cite lines from the Bible, Samara and Gomorrah, and to show that homosexuality is a sin, and the worst things you can say to a child who comes out to you. And so her rejection is just a massive blow to his self-worth, his morale, his willingness to continue to just live. And so he misses school, eventually becomes chronically truant and drops out, and severely depressed. And fortunately, he had a laptop and turned to YouTube as a way to cope with his situation. He found a YouTube channel, Davey Wavy's YouTube channel, where he talks about some of the issues that queer people have when coming out to family members who may not be as responsive or supportive. And through that, he recognizes that the experience that he had was not that he was not alone, that he was not the only person who was going through these tribulations, that there were millions of young people around the country and the world who were also struggling with their sexuality and orientation and their interactions with their family members. And I think those, making friends with queer people online and watching those YouTube videos saved his life and allowed him to find some level of semblance and peace with his identity. And then finally, Giancarlos Rodriguez is the third main character. And I tell the story of Giancarlos growing up, but his story is most powerful when I think frame it in the context of the history of public education in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia has been a guinea pig in the long-standing privatization experiment. In the early 2000s, there was an attempt by the state of Pennsylvania to take over the Philadelphia schools in a state takeover, and then privatize it and sell off some of those schools to private providers. There was enormous resistance from teachers' unions and students and other community members, and they were able to prevent some of the takeover as well as some of the privatization, but still dozens of schools were auctioned off in many respects to Edison schools and other for-profit providers. And then later on, Paul Vallas comes into power. He's the new CEO of the Philadelphia School District. And Paul Vallas is this fascinating character. You may know that name because he recently ran for mayor of Chicago. He's kind of this cartoonish villain character in corporate school reform histories because he has led the schools in Philadelphia, in New Orleans, in Chicago, in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He's exported this market-based reform model to school districts all over the country. And in Chicago, when he ran for mayor, the voters resolutely rejected him, partly based on his track record in undermining public education in the city. But this is well before that. And so this is the 2000s. Paul Vallas comes into office. He begins to dramatically expand charter schools, which are publicly funded, privately managed schools. Then he imposes a ruthless, zero-tolerance disciplinary policy, suspensions and expulsions, and disciplinary school transfers to schools like CEP and others. So those are some of the dominant policies in the 2000s. And then in 2013, Giancarlos is in middle school, and the Philadelphia schools are facing a billion-dollar budget deficit, and they decide that the way to plug that deficit is to close down dozens and dozens of public schools. And so they decide they propose to close 24 public schools. Eventually goes through one of the largest mass school closures in American history, displacing tens of thousands of students, particularly and disproportionately African American Latino students and low-income students, and then displacing thousands of teachers and support staff and other staff members. And Giancarlos was part of an organization called Youth Unite for Change, a youth-led educational justice organization that fought against the school closures in Philadelphia. They held walkouts and protests and letter-writing campaigns. They testified at city council. They pressured lawmakers and city council members. They did everything possible to try to stop those closures, but were unfortunately very unsuccessful. But it showed Giancarlos a few things. It showed him the power of youth activism. It showed him that he did indeed have rights. Even though he was an adult, he had rights to shape his education, and that it was incumbent upon people in power to listen to the youth voice and to what they had to say. So it was a deeply empowering exercise, despite the lack of success that he and his fellow activists had during that time. And then I trace Giancarlos' life in high school, where he now feels the full brunt of the new austerity measures that were imposed shortly after the school closures. There were hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of cuts in the schools, which meant that class sizes were sometimes upwards of 40 students. There was a lack of art and music and physical education, among other extracurricular activities. There was very, very few counselors, oftentimes one counselor for 300, 400 students, so very, very high ratios. And then on top of that, many of these school buildings were completely falling apart. The degraded school infrastructure, asbestos and lead, and just very old buildings. Literally where kids would be drinking out of water fountains that were probably laced with lead, the pipes, and so completely inhabitable, unfortunate conditions. And so he becomes an activist in his school, takes up the mantle of what he learned at YUC, and continues that work in organizing students against the austerity measures, against high-stakes standardized testing, and zero-tolerance school discipline. He becomes kind of a thorn in the side of the school administration, where on a random day he's just getting kids to walk out of school and protest, and eventually that, in addition to he got into a school fight, those two things together got him pushed out of school and eventually gets sent to El Centro de Estudiantes. So these are the three kids that make up this narrative, and I tell their stories from childhood to adulthood in the wake of welfare reform, hyper-incarceration, and educational privatization. And then I also tell the stories of the lives of their mothers, because I thought it was very important to provide an intergenerational account to show the ways in which poverty, inequality, incarceration, and other social problems are transmitted and reproduced from one generation to the next. Not because of genetics or biology or culture, but because these children are often subjected to some of the same conditions that their parents and grandmothers and grandfathers were also subjected to, a level of great deprivation and economic insecurity. And so, and I finally end with their quest to graduate high school, how they went through enormous obstacles to try to get to the end of school. And so their stories are interlaced with their struggles and tribulations, as well as the history of the neighborhood of Philadelphia and of Kensington. And so Kensington is the poorest neighborhood of the poorest large city in America. And to paint a little bit of a picture for you, if you're familiar with Philadelphia, in Center City, I would take the 47 bus from Society Hill, a leafy, affluent, mostly white neighborhood. And I would take that bus, and that bus would go up north. And over the next 15, 20 minutes, you would see various neighborhoods come into full picture. And eventually you arrive in North Philadelphia, the larger part of Kensington. And that neighborhood is a neighborhood where you find abandoned homes and abandoned lots, very old, dilapidated row homes. Puerto Rican flags and bodegas are known as poppy stores, and other cultural symbols. I would argue that, or I would portray it as the industrial carcasses of these former factories that once existed. And so my job as an ethnographer, as a sociologist, was to connect both agency and structure and history. So you have these kids' lives, and that's agency, structure, the political, economic institutions and policies, and then the history. How do we arrive at the conditions that exist in the neighborhood today? And so it provided me a very important outlook to examine the inequalities at play. And in Kensington, where I first originated, comparing the two neighborhoods, Society Hill and Kensington, babies born in Kensington are expected to live to the age of 71. 17 fewer years than the babies born in Society Hill. Just a massive contrast and dichotomy in life expectancy. Kensington is also the site of the largest open-air drug market on the East Coast, where the purest and most pure and cheapest heroin is peddled on the streets, where there's hundreds of overdoses each and every year in the neighborhoods. So to examine that, I look to history. I look to the 19th and the 20th century, when Kensington was a radically different place. It was the site of the world's largest and most diverse textile industry, where on virtually every street corner there was a textile mill pumping out millions and millions of goods for the global economy. And you could drop out of school one day and within a couple hours find a job in one of these factories that would provide you with a decent middle-class livelihood, with good wages and benefits and a pension. And so I tell the story of how those industries, the textile industries, withered away as a result of foreign competition and other domestic challenges, and then other geopolitical struggles with the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system, the end of the gold standard, and other forces that contribute to deindustrialization in Philadelphia and across the United States. And then you had, while you had Puerto Rican migration, you had the introduction of the war on drugs in the 1970s and 80s, where heroin and cocaine were hit the streets of Philadelphia like a tornado, engulfing entire families and communities into the drug trade and others on the other side of addiction. And so many of the characters in the book, Ryan's family members, came of age in the 1980s at the time of the crack epidemic, and how that shaped their upbringing and their economic and employment situation. So what you previously had was a very robust manufacturing sector gave way to two new economies: a service sector, which was usually paid low-wage employment, plus an underground economy, which was precarious, exploitative, and very dangerous labor, the drug economy, sex work, and other forms of employment. And so those conditions led to the current situation in Kensington. And then in 1996, you had welfare reform, which decimated aid to families with dependent children, a New Deal program, and replaced it with TANF, as I mentioned, which meant that mothers, particularly single mothers, were no longer guaranteed an unconditional sum of income each month to cover basic necessities. And the research has shown that deep poverty has gone up dramatically since the passage of welfare reform. Food insecurity has gone up. Housing insecurity has gone up. It has taken a great toll and a target at some of the poorest children and families in this country. And so those are some of the histories that help explain what these children are enduring. So just to conclude, at the end of the book, it's a very depressing book. Not going to try to sugarcoat it, but it's also, I think, a very hopeful book, because I show that the issues that I talk about, whether it's poverty or economic insecurity, those issues are not intractable problems. They're problems that are very, very solvable. During the pandemic, we saw a Republican president, Donald Trump, and a Democratic president, Joe Biden, enact trillions of dollars of spending, whether it was the economic impact payments, the stimulus checks, expanded unemployment insurance, and then expanded child tax credit. Collectively, those three policies lifted millions upon millions of children out of poverty and economic insecurity. And so when the government wants to spend the money, they find the money and they make people's lives better. And so I think the pandemic showed, despite the enormous amount of death and suffering that people endured, it showed that with the political will, we can actually reduce child poverty and overall poverty and economic insecurity if there's sufficient political will. I cite in the book a study by the National Academies, which found that the annual toll, the cost of child poverty each year, ranges from $800 billion to $1.1 trillion. So whether you care about child poverty or not, that is money being taken out of all of our pockets. That is affecting all of us, all of our bottom lines, in the form of higher spending on public assistance programs, higher crime, and lower economic productivity. It is a drain on our entire economy. So when we talk about abolishing and eliminating child poverty and economic insecurity, that is fundamentally a pro-economic growth agenda that will ultimately help people who are not necessarily even living in those conditions of desperation. So I end with a blueprint, and and this blueprint really, the goal is to create a cradle-to-grave social democracy. And in 2021, I had the chance to try to put some of these policies into fruition when I had the opportunity to work for Senator Sanders on the Senate Budget Committee. And when I came in, my very first day of the Senate was the day the American Rescue Plan was passed. And then we got to work on a piece of legislation that some of you might be familiar with, called Build Back Better. And it felt like I had an enormous responsibility. I'd seen I witnessed what had happened in Kensington, what those children and families endured. I'd been to Goddard, and I'd seen what families in the kingdom had to endure. I'd been to other urban and rural neighborhoods marked by great levels of economic insecurity. And so I felt a great sense of responsibility to enact public policies that would ultimately shape and help these people's lives. And it reminded me I spent a lot of time reading about the New Deal and the Great Society and the policymakers' responses during that time. What FDR had to endure in the wake of the Great Depression, where fascism and authoritarianism was on the march in Europe and in this country, that they rose to the occasion and were willing to enact the policies that improved working people's lives. So in the wake of the pandemic, I thought we had an incredible opportunity to finish the unfinished business of the New Deal and the Great Society, to provide people with a decent standard of living once and for all. And the programs I worked on all the way range from a permanent expanded child tax credit, to free pre-K, to affordable childcare, to tuition-free public college. We worked on all sorts of things. And then my other colleagues, they worked on investment in affordable housing, in home care investment, expanding Medicare to include dental, vision, and hearing. Virtually every piece of this legislation would affect every American at various phases of their lives, from childhood all the way to birth, to death. And so I think that it was just a remarkable piece of legislation. As many of you know, one Democratic senator and 50 Senate Democrats were opposed to that piece of legislation, and so we were not able to get the full agenda through Congress. But I'm very happy that we were able to get a version of that in the Inflation Reduction Act, a major climate investment, and prescription drug reform, and some expansion of healthcare subsidies. But the work still continues, and I'm hopeful that when there is a Democratic trifecta in Washington again, when we have both the House and the Senate and the presidency, that we will make those necessary changes to provide people with dignity and security and prosperity. Because I simply argue two things. One is, we cannot, in a country as rich as ours, we cannot condemn poor working class children and families to premature death and suffering while some people live decent, dignified lives. And two, we cannot accept a country where we have the wealth and resources to provide everyone with a decent life. And so I think if we are going to protect American democracy, if we are going to ensure American democracy for future generations and protect it against the rising forces of revanchism and authoritarianism and anti-democratic forces, then we've got to do everything in our power to end fully and permanently poverty and economic security for all of our people. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought the story full circle to say we had a test during the COVID period of what spending money means, what effect it can have. It seems to me, at the age I am, I don't think we spent any money since the Vietnam War. We stopped either having the money to spend or we chose not to spend it. And now it seems like that period has abruptly ended, even though we have evidence of the success of putting some money in people's hands with certain intentions. Do you think it's over?
I mean, I think it's a great tragedy that many of these pandemic era programs have now expired. For those of you who want to read more about this, I wrote a piece for the New York Times in September about some of the indicators of rising economic insecurity and food insecurity and other metrics as these pandemic era programs have winded down. Just this year, in March, we had the end of a Medicaid provision that automatically enrolled people even if they didn't always qualify. We saw the end of the emergency SNAP allotment, which meant that for some families they were losing hundreds of dollars a month in food benefits. We've seen the emergency rental assistance, the two tranches of that wind down, and most of the money has now been distributed, which means that a lot of families are now facing evictions and homelessness. We have also seen in this month, at the end of September, the end of the federal emergency child care funding, which some people would argue will put at risk more than 3 million children to lose their child care and close down tens of thousands of child care centers. So it's just a cascading series of forces, and I think it's just going to pummel and punish families at a time where they're already barely making ends meet. So that makes me very frustrated and angry because that we weren't able to make those programs permanent. But we're seeing the consequences of the failure to pass Build Back Better today.
Yeah, you had mentioned, and if you don't mind repeating, if you could paraphrase at least the question for the people on the live show.
Sure, yeah.
From what I understand, you said, in your opinion, this requires the Democrats to control the three branches of government in order for things to move ahead. It's not lost on me that welfare reform came through under President Clinton. So
right.
Some of what was done in terms of really what some people consider kickstarting mass incarceration was also put through by the person who's now our current president, and I don't know if it's so much impacted this particular neighborhood, but there's definitely a lot of impacts in working class as a result of NAFTA, which also came through in a Democratic administration. So I'm not sure, if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, and so the question was relating the some of the policies from welfare reform to NAFTA to carceral policies that happened under a Democratic president like Bill Clinton, and how you kind of square that with the idea that we need a Democratic trifecta again. I mean, the remarkable thing, and I would say in a large part due to social movements like Occupy Wall Street, Fight for 15, the Black Lives Matter movement, among other, and the trade union movement, plus Senator Sanders' campaign, Elizabeth Warren's work, and other progressive lawmakers, we have, I think, seen a radical reshifting of the framing of the debate and the consensus in this country about what we need to do. And I think the pandemic showed, for example, with the stimulus checks, that we can give stimulus checks to every American in some degree. And so I think it gave space for us to actually then fully support 49 Democrats on board with an expanded child tax credit, that we can actually send out checks to every family, every parent who has a kid, a kid under the age of 18. So I think that has changed. And I think in terms of incarceration and criminal justice policy, there's been some progress made, and even under the previous president, there was some legislation on that. I think it's, I'm less optimistic about on that front. I think it really will depend on prosecutors and district attorneys and states, because that's really where the fight around criminal justice reform is most acutely felt. But the federal government can make important regulations and policies, all the way from, I would say, pushing for the legalization of marijuana or other decriminalization, and where those federal grants are going to. Is it going to more punitive enforcement, or is it going to actually reducing and addressing the root causes of crime and violence? So I think there's an important role to play, but I think we've seen a radical reshifting of the framing of the debate. What people will call the neoliberal consensus has been shattered, and I think that is, as I said, a large part due to social movements and Sanders, Warren, and other people. Yeah.
It seems like, if I understand it right, what you're suggesting is the most impactful programs to address poverty are getting cash into people's hands. Talking about the traditional welfare versus the lower and child tax credit, versus more social programs or indirect sort of benefits. Is your understanding of the evidence that that's where the bang for our buck is?
Yeah. So the question was, do you find that putting money in people's pockets in the form of these checks are a good investment in a way to address poverty in the broadest scope? So I think there's a couple things I would say. One is, I think we can make some of these very clear what they're called direct cash transfers. That's what economists call them. So like an expanded child tax credit or a stimulus check. So I think that is very important. But I would cite the work of Amartya Sen, the great economist, who said that poverty is not simply a shortage of income. It is also a shortage of capabilities. And capabilities, as he describes them, are the basic necessities for dignified life. And so good employment, housing, health, food, among other, clean air, clean water, clean environment, all those things. Those are things that can be fundamentally achieved through a more expansion of public goods. I'm a big believer in the public option in different sectors. A public option in broadband, in housing, in healthcare, in education, so that at least there's a public provision of direct services. And we can still live with markets, but it means that there's more competition within those spheres, and I think that will ultimately reduce costs for consumers, and then make sure that people are getting those basic goods that allow us to sustain life, so they don't have to be price gouged by health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. They actually have the guarantee of getting access to those benefits.
If I may, Ollie.
Sure.
I'm struck by the systemic nature of some of this, and I think about this a lot, and maybe other people do too, just in terms of these industrial neighborhoods where, as you were saying, or others have said, you could have a high school education and get a good job and buy a house and raise a family and maybe even send kids to college on that. And that sort of opportunity disappearing from those neighborhoods. And here in Vermont, we're not immune to that either. We have parts of our state that were industrialized that are very different now than they were in 1970, for instance. And so, anyway, I'm struck by the complex nature of this, that it's a period of economic development that maybe had its day in the past, and I'm just sort of, maybe I'm understanding a bit of what you're saying in terms of what's coming, but is the solution something like industry?
Yeah.
in these neighborhoods? Is it somehow a return to that economic opportunity in these neighborhoods?
Yeah. So the question was, is industry a potential solution, or returning to this kind of industrial-minded solution to some of our woes? Yeah, I think it's, the president and the administration have made some important strides in adopting what is known as industrial policy. And so deploying or pushing capital and business and incentivizing them to create factories and opportunities in economically neglected and disinvested areas. And so you see that most prominently with the CHIPS and Science Act. We've now spending billions of dollars on subsidizing the production of semiconductors as a way of a national security imperative, so that we're not reliant on Taiwan, but also to build up some of these manufacturing towns that have seen industry come and go over the past several decades. So I think that is helpful. I'm also very encouraged by the Inflation Reduction Act and the energy subsidies, where many of these areas, they could be a site of clean energy production, and in whatever facet that might be. And so I think that could be a way to provide good-paying union jobs to economically disinvested areas, as well as shoring up those communities, because I believe very strongly that that people should not have to get a college degree in order to have a decent life, that everyone should be able to have a decent life in America. Yes, by all means, should we provide opportunities and make it as easy and cost efficient as possible for someone to get a higher education? Absolutely. But I think many of those jobs they don't require more than a high school diploma or an associate's degree, and I think it's very important that we create jobs for those folks, so that we're not replicating and reproducing those cycles of poverty. Yeah.
In my experience in neighborhoods like the ones you described, we lived for 10 years in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which shares a lot of history with Kensington. And that's where, he was born and started school in the charter school. The state also took over that district.
Yeah.
And I know more about it. But what strikes me there in a lot of places is just the stark segregation. And Lawrence being literally 3 miles from the village center, and very compliant suburbs, and places like, Kingston, obviously, you mentioned the proximity to the city center, obviously other suburbs and places where there's great schools. How much of this is about place in your life, and what do we do about that? I mean, coming here and saying, I don't know if you know the history of St. Johnsbury, but this institution, the St. Johnsbury Academy, which is an interesting model, where it's a private school that kids go on tuition from town.
Right.
And pretty much everything else that's nice about this town was built because I think people that own the Capitol lived here. And so I think it's just a different example of how that worked. I mean, this was 100 years ago when this was happening, right? What's the solution in a modern economy to segregation and the poverty of place?
Sure.
How do we do that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the question was, what is the role of place and neighborhood in these issues, and how we perhaps can overcome some of these challenges. So it's an important one. I mean, as a sociologist, my orientation is always geared towards several concepts. It's always, you have race, you have class, you have gender, and you have place. So those are all phenomena that orient the way I look at situations and conditions. And so I think place in and of itself, and as many theorists have now argued, is a fundamental player and in the production of inequality. And so you hear this term, your zip code should not be your destiny. And if you look at the evidence, and Raj Chetty and among other economists have found that yes, place has enormous influence on a person's trajectory, their economic conditions. I mean, in Philadelphia, if I'm correct, I think it's like less than 1 out of 13 kids born in the bottom quintile will make it up to the top quintile. And so the levels of social mobility in this country are nil in many respects. And in some of these neighborhoods, it's almost nothing. So that is a very stark contrast, neighbor to neighbor. But I think it's very important that we have placed what is known as place-based sociology, or place conscious policies, where we are designing things based on neighborhoods and building up those neighborhoods. Some people would argue that it could mean reducing the segregation. I think there's some great efforts around bringing lower income people into higher income neighborhoods through vouchers, and that's helpful. But that's not necessarily a structural solution. I believe in building affordable housing to address segregation, and so I think that's one effective way. But I think there's a lot of things that need to be done to really break the kind of stranglehold of residential segregation. And it's not going to take a few years. It will take centuries to get there, because this has been going on for that many years. And I think it's one of those issues where there's a lot more resistance to it than others, particularly on the housing question. Yep.
Research for a lot of years on the book. How long did it take you to write it? And was that a dissertation? Because it doesn't read like one. It's really readable.
Yeah. So yes, so I started working on it in 2015. It took 8 years to write. I finished it just at the beginning of this year, and it was a very grueling process of writing the book, reporting it. I mean, I was very grateful to have some incredible editors. Reber Hotchman is my editor at Metropolitan, who's just the most wonderful human being. So very indebted to her and her very sharp editorial hand. And so I think the reporting process was very strenuous and exhaustive, but then the writing process of constantly going through many, many drafts was also very strenuous. And so I turned the dissertation into the book, so I had to kind of strip it of a lot of its theory and the more arcane academic language to make it more readable. And my hope is that it will be a book. It is a book that anybody will pick up and be able to read it, whether you are a sociologist or know anything about child poverty or any of these issues. Yeah.
Working with at that young age, you might have helped their success.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm certainly in touch with them. You know, the book came out August 22nd, so our first event was in Philadelphia. We had a panel of Ryan, Karem, and Giancarlos and their family members, which was really lovely. And just the other week I was in Philly, and we just did a radio interview with the three of them and me. So it's really nice for I think the public to hear from them. And it's not always possible, but I think when it is possible, it's to see them today. I think it's a very heartwarming and uplifting tale. And yeah, I think I had somewhat of impact on their trajectories. But I think that, by the time I'd met them, I think well, okay, let me answer this way. I think the fact that I was interested and engaged in their lives, I think, helped them realize that there was something more that they could accomplish. That, I certainly encouraged them to go to college, and Karem did try community college at one point, and then due to housing costs, stopped going to school, but hopes to go back one day. And then Ryan, I keep in touch, and then whenever he has needs career advice or employment advice, I'm always there to help them. And to me, it's an ongoing friendship with the three kids and their families. And if you read the acknowledgement section, I think I try to do a great service, at least in acknowledging all of their contributions to the book. Because while my name is certainly on the cover, it really takes a village to write something like this. And so they are really the stars of the book. And I think the way I've written it lets their stories and their opinions drive the narrative and be the focus.
You also mentioned that one of them went to City Hall to advocate for the school.
Yep.
The school is in trouble. Is the school still going?
Yes, still the school. Yes, so you asked about the question was about is the school still alive? Yes, El Centro is still going strong. They have now moved around a little bit in North Philly. Had some struggles during the pandemic, but it's still doing well, and like many alternative schools, it has ebbs and flows. But I think I hope that it will remain a cornerstone of public education in Kensington and in North Philly. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here. All right.